To tag or not to tag, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the studio to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous comments, or to take arms against a sea of thumbs down, and by opposing, end them, to delete, to sleep. No more, and by sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that booktube is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to delete, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this digital coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long a channel. Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and thank you for joining me on the Shakespeare Journey Tag. This was originally created by the current hosts of Shaketember, Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading, Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and Nicole at A Day of Small Things, and Kelly kindly tagged me in her original video. So prompt 1, what was your first experience reading Shakespeare and what was it like? Now my first experience viewing Shakespeare is the scene in Tombstone when Billy Zane's character at the sort of vaudeville theater house has the St. Crispin's Day speech from Henry V, and I didn't know what on earth that was. It was very different from anything I had seen, and I was like, okay. But my first experience actually reading Shakespeare was when I was 12 years old, and I was in 7th grade here in the US, and I was in a grammar class, and we had sort of finished what was going on that part of the term, and so the teacher had us actually read Shakespeare. We read a couple of plays. The ones I remember were Macbeth and Hamlet, and by read I mean we actually received printed out packets of the plays, and we would receive them an act at a time, and we'd go through the scenes and we'd be given characters that we were each going to play in the class. I think it was a smaller group that was sort of some sort of like advanced honors grammar class such that there is, and we had a huge amount of fun reading it. I remember I got to read Macbeth. In Hamlet I read a couple of different roles. I didn't get to read Hamlet or Horatio or Claudius, but I read a couple of sort of other roles in that. Just loved it. The language, being able to, we would get up and we would sort of act out in a 45-minute, class, one of the acts, and work through a couple of the scenes and write out a summary of what had happened. It was so fun. It was just ridiculously fun. After that, I read Richard III on my own, sort of the next year. And then in school, 2 years later, we read Romeo and Juliet, we read Julius Caesar, we read A Midsummer Night's Dream, over like one each year. And just gradually, I returned to Shakespeare. I returned to Shakespeare when I was in college. I continued to read a play by him every year, and it's something I really enjoy. So prompt 2, has the reading of a Shakespeare play ever brought you to tears? What scene and where were you when it happened? Now this is a very specific sort of sequence of memories, so bear with me. I've never cried when reading a Shakespeare play for the first time. But if you've ever seen the film My Darling Clementine, directed by John Ford from the 40s, there's a scene where there's a theater troupe that has arrived in town, in this western town, and everybody's excited. And it turns out that the main Shakespearean British actor, who's touring the southwestern U.S. to put on his little plays, is at the bar getting absolutely, hammered. And they go and find him, and he stands up on a table and does the to be or not to be speech from Hamlet, and he breaks off at a certain point and realizes he can't remember the lines, and the tubercular Doc Holliday character says, hey, he gives him the line. I think it's it's the but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler turns. It's that line. And so he gives him but that the dread of something after death. And the actor nods and then goes, I can't remember, pray continue. And I had seen that. And what happened was my grandfather was in his 80s. He was my last surviving grandparent. This is about 12 years ago. And he, for some reason, somebody made a little to be or not to be reference at dinner one night. And we were having dinner with him. And this is before my daughters were born. This is before my wife and I were married, I believe. So it's been about 12 years. And he started reciting to be or not to be. And he's doing this from memory. And this is towards the end of his life. He would pass away about 18 months later. And he gets stuck at a certain point. It wasn't that exact line, but he got stuck. And I was sitting right next to him. And he couldn't continue. And he kind of looked at me knowing that I could remember it. And so I continued on for him. And so I can't reread that specific line. It's hard for me to even like watch that in a film or in a production. It's hard for me to watch that scene because reading that or hearing that takes me back to those memories of how much I loved him. The deep tragic irony of someone at the end of life saying that, not a young person who's sort of questing and searching for answers and trying to decide, should I continue on, or is this sort of nihilistic path the one I want to go down? But rather it's someone who's at the end, who has lived this full life, remembering those lines and how the poetry and the philosophy of behind that speech changes in that period. And so I just, that one is very hard. I'm probably tearing up right now. That one's very hard for me to experience because it makes me think about him and how much I respected him and how he was someone who would read Shakespeare and knew Shakespeare and could look at me and knew that I did it, and there was like this affinity there. And the fact that he passed away before my kids were born, or that he was the last of my grandparents to be alive. So it brings back that. It brings back the fact that like my father had already passed away at that point. So there's all of these emotions that come up that have almost nothing to do with like that specific text, but it's all of my experiences around it and that singular memory. So that's my response to that question. I'm sorry it was so long-winded, but hopefully it humanizes me. Prompt 3, are there any people who played a significant role in your Shakespeare journey? My grandfather, my 7th grade grammar teacher, Mrs. Steenstra, for actually having us read that when we were 12 and 13 and recognizing that we could appreciate it if we had some fun and acted it out rather than just sitting silently, miserably looking through and looking at the glosses, and just having her say, look, let's have fun with this. Let's have that experience. And then I had a friend in college named Ken, who owns a bike shop now. And he was someone else who sort of like me had fallen into Shakespeare on his own, had just a couple of experiences that were positive. And so he was reading it on his own throughout high school and throughout our time in college. And so we would read and talk about it with each other. And it was just something that I really bonded with him over. So that was fun. Prompt 4, do you have a favorite book or film about Shakespeare? Shakespeare in Love, follow that boat. His name is Mercutio. That's a good name. I love that film. Prompt 5, which character in Shakespeare most resembles you and in what way? Well, not to be overly personal again, but there was a time in my life where my father and I had a massive falling out. He was having some choices he had made that were having pretty negative ramifications, consequences for himself, for his own health, for everyone in our family. And as sort of the oldest child, I was finding that I was in a lot of conflict with him, and I was sort of the one who was willing to, call him out when there were problems, and have sort of the real talk. And things got really bad at the end. But there are ways in which he really resembled Falstaff when I found Falstaff as a character in the Henry IV plays, in the way that he, at his best, he was incredibly funny. He could make up those ridiculous stories that exaggerate and exaggerate and exaggerate, but he could recognize himself as the butt of the joke at times. So he had all those qualities, but he was also very self-destructive. And so the end of Henry IV Part 2, where Hal makes this decision to say, I have to reject you. Like you will destroy me as you are in the process of destroying yourself. And like, this cannot happen. There's an element of like 16-year-old Jack that absolutely felt that way, that was drawn to that moment and felt, it was almost like reading something like that gave me permission to stand up to my father, not necessarily to reject him, but to stand up to him and feel like somebody had to, call out what was happening. But to be more positive, I think Viola in Twelfth Night, in part, particularly the way that she can be malleable to try and transform and change situations. That's something I try to do as an adult, is understand sort of where I fit into a situation and what can I do to have the most positive impact in that moment, whether it's as a parent, whether it's as a spouse, whether it's, as an instructor, whether it's as a department chair or a child or a friend, to try and have that impact. I aspire to be more like Horatio, boring as he is, because he's honest, he's trustworthy, dependable, he's a good friend, and that's someone I aspire to be. I don't think I get there enough. As I've gotten older into my 30s, I feel more like Mark Antony at times, and less Antony from Julius Caesar, and more the Antony from Antony and Cleopatra, where it's like this guy who's, I always wonder, have I hit my peak? Have I hit my peak as an instructor? Have I hit my peak as a reader, as a runner? Certainly I have. As a hiker, as a cyclist, like all of these different ways of life. And these paths and identities we find for ourselves, these vocations. I wonder, have I reached the point where I'm the Antony and Cleopatra, or am I still the one from Julius Caesar? Do I still have it? And so those are sort of the questions, the reflection I engage in. I'm grateful that I never became like Edmund from Lear, where he's sort of a nightmare version of Viola, where he'll become whatever he needs to for greed and avarice and self-destructive, like vengeful purposes. But what a character. Prompt 6, which play would you most like to see performed in a theater, and why? Love's Labour's Lost, I think. I've seen a number of Shakespeare plays. I've seen them. Everyone I've seen I've enjoyed. My high school that I teach at put on a production of Hamlet last year, and that was really fun. There were some people who didn't enjoy it. I loved it. I really just enjoy Shakespeare, I'll be honest. But I would love to see Love's Labour's Lost, because that is such a dynamic play. The use of language in that is just an explosion of language, of metaphor, of imagery. It is nonstop. There's such a vitality to the play. And as much as I try to bring that out when I read that play, I know that I feel like I would enjoy it so much more if I was able to see it in a production that really just captured that energy, that moved nonstop. That's a play that I've never quite found my way into appreciating it as much as I would like to, and I think a production would change that. So hopefully I'll see one soon. Prompt 7, what actor, while in his prime, would you have liked to see play Hamlet? Jason had a really great response about Ian Charleson at the end of his life playing Hamlet. And as I mentioned about thinking about my grandfather reciting that speech in his 80s and what the nearness of mortality brings to the play of Hamlet, I think Charleson would have captured that. Although it would have been fascinating to see the Daniel Day-Lewis, rehearsals that led to the massive breakdown in his abandoning sort of that role and sort of stage to a certain degree. I will say though that as sort of a cop-out answer, it's Ian Charleson. But the one I would most want to see is I want to see Paul Robeson as Othello back in the 40s, particularly with the context of Uta Hagen playing Desdemona and Jose Ferrer playing Iago when they're married to each other, and some other stuff behind these. But I think I would have loved that performance. I enjoy Robeson as an actor. That would have been truly transcendent. Prompt 8, deliver your favorite speech or soliloquy from a Shakespeare play. Well, when I was young, I thought I was really clever, and so I set up my voicemail message on my cell phone at one point when I was in college to say, hey, can you hold on just a second? And I paused, and then to give the person time to reply, yeah, sure, hold on, as if I was answering the actual phone, not a message. And then I tore into, oh, gentlemen, the time of life is short. To spend that shortness basely were too long, if life did ride upon dial's point, still ending at the arrival of an hour. And if we live to tread on kings, if die, brave death, when princes die with us. Now for our consciences, the arms are fair, when the intent of bearing them is just. I thank him that cuts me from my tale, for I profess not talking only this. Let each man do his best. And here I draw a sword whose temper I intend to stain, with the best blood that I can meet withal in the adventure of this perilous day. By that music let us all embrace, for heaven to earth, some of us never shall, a second time, do such a courtesy. Because I thought that Hotspur in Henry IV Part 1 was just the best. Even though, of course, he's sort of a parody of this guy who cannot complete a thought and is just overcome by his emotions. And as a contrast to the way that Prince Hal will become more calculating and careful and intentional and successful. But as I've aged over the past 15, 16, 17 years from when I had that absurd message. I enjoy John of Gaunt's speech in Act 2 from Richard II, where the opening is sort of something from Seneca, where every line or every other couple of lines is this like aphorism. And then he has the beautiful speech. Oh, but they say the tongues of dying men enforce attention like deep harmony. Where words are scarce, they are seldom spent in vain, for they breathe true that breathe their words in pain. He that no more must say is listen more than they whom youth and ease have taught to gloss. More are men's ends marked than their lives before, the setting sun and music at the close, as the last taste of sweets is sweetest last, writ in remembrance more than things long past. Though Richard my life's counsel would not hear, my death's sad tale might yet undeaf his ear. And so there's that sort of influence of Seneca. And then he has the long speech where he talks about the emerald, the sceptered isle, and this idea of this beauty and garden in isolation that has this chance to grow and flourish in itself. And I think there's a way that holds as a metaphor in the latter 20th century for the US, and certainly the 21st century for the US, this idea of exceptionalism. But when we think about it, it starts to become this beautiful passage about our own exceptionalism, that in some way each of us ward off ourselves from others. We allow influences in, but in some way we refract it, we refine it in ourselves to become our own individuals. And yet to realize that there is always this capability for the same destruction from within that Gaunt is worried about. Methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell of him, his rash fierce blaze of riot cannot last. For violent fires soon burn out themselves. Small showers last long, but sudden storms are short. He tires betimes that spurs too fast betimes. With eager feeding food doth choke the feeder. Light vanity, insatiate cormorant, consuming means soon preys upon itself. This royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serveth it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home, for Christian service and true chivalry, as is the sepulchre and stubborn jury of the world's ransom, blessed Mary's son, this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or a pelting farm, England bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England, and was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Ah, would the scandal vanish with my life, how happy then were my ensuing death. Anyways. Prompt 9, do any of Shakespeare's plays intimidate you? If yes, what play and why? King Lear did for a long time. I had a habit of reading sort of at least one play by Shakespeare every year. I had a period in my early 20s and my latter teens where I was reading a couple of his plays, just sort of devouring them. Different genres, histories, tragedies, comedies. I discovered that there were the romances and problem plays, and sort of I was picking one from each year, just reading them and just enjoying them. And I had this sense that Lear was something special, that I needed to sort of prep my reading. I needed to spend time reading other works and sort of getting ready for what Lear was going to bring me. I watched Kurosawa's Ran and loved it. And then when I read Lear, I just wholeheartedly was enthusiastic. I couldn't believe what that play accomplished, just how horrifying and depressing that work is. But I don't know, it intimidated me, but it was more that I wanted to make sure I measured up to it. There's a way in which Antony and Cleopatra intimidated me for a while, because I struggled when I was younger to understand the characterization of Antony there. And I'll talk more about it at the end of this month when we go into that play. But I think that there's a really fascinating sort of triarchy of ideas going on in Antony and Cleopatra. One is sort of this compromised Antony, this incredible flourishing from Cleopatra, and then finally this mechanistic style within by Octavian of sort of these ways that still speak and resonate in the 21st century that I'm fascinated by. So that's one that intimidated me at one point, but I think I've found my way into that play. I think the one I still am working towards fully grasping is Othello. I think that there has been this massive desire to centralize the play Othello around the villain of Iago. And it's just so easy to do that. I think a lot of readers do that, a lot of sort of critics, people who write about Shakespeare, find Iago sort of this character they can examine and pick at and are interested by. And I think it's important to recognize that Othello is the central character of that play. It's very hard to have and sustain a reading that recognizes Othello and Desdemona as equal parts of the tragedy, not as Iago as this master puppet villain manipulating everyone, and that it is truly Othello's tragedy, not Othello as this dupe of Iago. So I think that's a reading that I continue to press towards right now in my 30s. Prompt 10. What tips would you give to intimidated readers coming to Shakespeare for the first time? Okay, the first one I would say is go for one that you have some type of connection to. I got into Richard III as a play, and I'll talk about this when we do Richard III this month, because I had read about the Wars of the Roses and sort of the Princes in the Tower, and so I was coming at it from this historical perspective of like, oh, how did Shakespeare sort of contextualize these ideas and help create this myth of who Richard III was? I thought that was interesting. But I would say sort of the two experiences that helped me enjoy Shakespeare and appreciate Shakespeare is to read it aloud, read his works aloud, and read it with a group if possible. So I have 4 copies of this collected works of Shakespeare. And I got one for my wife when we started dating each other sort of seriously. And we knew, okay, we're going to be dating each other for the foreseeable future and spending time together. And so we each had a copy of the same collected works of Shakespeare. And so when our eldest daughter was born, she was probably 2 at the time, I went and found a used copy of this. And then a couple years ago, I found another used copy of it. So we now have 4 for everyone in the family. As the girls are able to read more, we'll read these as a group and take on the roles and act them out and enjoy them. Because there's such vitality in Shakespeare, and that can be missed if you're just reading it on the page. Don't worry about the language that you're missing. Pay attention to the language that you're getting. Prompt 11, which is your favorite Shakespeare play and why? As you like it. It's fun. Rosalind is absolute dynamite, my favorite character from Shakespeare. I aspire to emulate those qualities as well. But the other one that I love, and I've loved for, gosh, it's 25 years now, Macbeth. It's incredible. Prompt 12, to tag or not to tag. Well, I'm going to be tagging. I'll tag Brian over at Bookish. I'm going to tag David Novak Reads Poetry. I mean, come on. I'm going to tag Shelley Swearingen. I don't know if I've seen her do a tag super recently, so I'll tag her. I'm going to tag Quentin at Idjit Reads and Rambles because he's like studying English, so he probably knows more about this than I do. I will tag Jason at Channel the Disappointed Man. I know his semester started, but he's also studying English at a very deep level. I'd be curious to know what he thinks. And then I'll tag someone else who I've seen doing tags on and off. She seems to really enjoy those, the Book Collectics. So tag, you're tagged as well. Let's all join in on this one and have a journey through Shakespeare together. Thank you.